Thank you, Stuart. You might be wondering why I would come here in the middle of the winter, but if this is winter, I'll take it. Also, this is the WAFL season, and I didn't want to miss that. So I want to talk about what's the announced title, Hayek's Theory of Boom and Bust and the Global Financial Crisis. So how many of you have seen the Hayek and Keynes rap videos, Fear the Boom and Bust? Okay. So I wrote this book that Stuart just mentioned, which I like to think of as a sort of compendium to those videos. And the reason I like to say that is those videos have had over 3 million hits. So if everybody who watches the videos buys my book, you can do the math. So in case you can't see it behind me, I told the publisher I would flog it. So sort of spread through the early chapters is the contest between Hayek and Keynes for basically over explaining the Great Depression. All right, so there's this massive event and this boom that gives way to a bust in 1929. The economy actually turns down a little bit before the stock market crash. So the stock market crash is more of a symptom than it is a cause. But it's an enormous decline. It goes on not for 6 months the way the crisis in 1921 had gone on, and it doesn't recover in 18 months the way the recovery in 21-22 happened, but it takes, well, the economy's not back on track really until after the Second World War, so it's an enormously drawn-out recovery. So what did economists have to say about this? Now, there's a myth out there promulgated by sort of one of my favorite foils in the book, Paul Krugman. Here's a statement he made in a particularly graceless article he wrote about Milton Friedman just after Friedman's death. But here's what he said about the business cycle theory. He said classical economics, and by classical economics he meant economics before Keynes. That was a way of talking that Keynes himself invented. Right? Any serious historian of economic thought knows that classical economics means labor theory of value, Adam Smith, Ricardo, all that stuff before the marginalist subjectivist revolution in 1871, and after that everybody's a neoclassical economist. But Keynes uses classical to mean everybody before Keynes. And Krugman uses it the same way. So classical economics offered neither explanations nor solutions for the Great Depression. By the middle of the 1930s, the challenges to orthodoxy could no longer be contained. So you get this picture that the economists were just dumbstruck by the Great Depression and decided not to say anything about it. They offered neither explanations nor solutions. They just, either they didn't notice it or they were just, had nothing to say. But of course they had lots to say, and Mises and Hayek were two of the important theorists coming out of Austria who had a monetary theory of the trade cycle. There were others in the United States, Irving Fisher, in England, people like Hawtrey. So there were lots of competing explanations. The Austrians were writing before 1929, so they already were developing an explanation, and some of them at least hinted that there was a crisis coming. And when the crisis came, they tried to explain what had happened, and Hayek in particular gave a series of lectures that was published in 1931 under the title Prices and Production. And the title indicates that Hayek thinks there's a problem that is being transmitted through the price system. If we want to understand why there's a system-wide expansion and contraction, we have to look at how the price system's been distorted, how it's been distorted by central bank policy, as it turns out, and how that has real effects on the structure of production in the economy. So there is, for a number of years, a rivalry between Hayek's ideas and Keynes's idea. Prices and production attracts a lot of attention and even a lot of followers. Now, some of these followers later became famous Keynesians. John Hicks, Arthur Smithies, Nicholas Kaldor, famous young English economists of the day, were attracted by Hayek's theory. But they eventually gave it up for Keynes's theory, which is a bit of a puzzle I want to talk about later. But in Hayek's view, the onset of the Great Depression, or the reason the boom couldn't last, was that it was unsustainable. It was carrying the seeds of its own collapse. It was built on false foundations. Monetary policy had falsified interest rates, kept interest rates too low, encouraging a certain kind of investment that is interest sensitive, namely investments that take a long time to come to fruition, investments that involve a great deal of capital intensity. And those are characteristic of the industries that suffered the most in the crash. If you look at index of industrial production, it rises during the boom and collapses completely, much more than retail or consumer spending collapses. So it's not variations in consumer spending that explain the swing in the economy, but it's variations in particular kinds of investment that are the most cyclically volatile. But Hayek's view is that the economy is bound by the sort of simple fact of scarcity, and scarcity means that there's a trade-off between consuming today and consuming tomorrow, or consuming today and investing for the sake of consumption tomorrow. And normally the price system will manage that, and the interest rate as part of the price system will coordinate savings and investment, and the economy will stay within a sustainable set of consumption and investment decisions, and those will be coordinated by financial markets. In Keynes's theory, that's all thrown out, and there is no mechanism that coordinates the economy through time. There's nothing that coordinates savings and investment. So savings and investment either both go up together, consumption and investment either both go up together or they both go down together. In Hayek's theory, there's normally a trade-off, but the economy got out of whack in the 20s because central banks injected credit, which made investors and consumers both want a bigger share of the pie. And for a little while, the economy can produce outside the sustainable frontier, but it can't last. And that's why the boom had to collapse. With the collapse, the businesses that start making losses are those where the investment was not sustainable, where it was premised on interest rates staying low, but interest rates have to rise when there aren't enough savings to go around, because they really are scarce resources that can't be overcommitted. And so the rising interest rate reveals the malinvestments, and those investments then have to be, some of them will have to be scrapped or liquidated, and the resources that were tied up in them released to go elsewhere in the economy. That's the recession. So the recession is actually a kind of curative period which remedies the problems of malinvestment that were created during the boom. So the time to avoid the problem is during the boom, not after the fact. There's a story that goes that Hayek's great teacher was Mises, or mentor, I guess I should say. He never took a course from him. But Mises was giving a talk about the problem of the business cycle and how in the recession the government should not get in the way of the process of reintegrating labor and capital into uses that can be sustained. They should step back and let the process take place. And reportedly a woman in the audience raises her hand and says, Professor Mises, are you saying that the government should start doing nothing? And he says, Madam, in my view, they should have started doing nothing a long time ago. Hayek's diagnosis of the boom, and I think this diagnosis, unfortunately, also applies, to the most recent boom we had in the early years of the 21st century. It's that there is an increase in the demand for investable resources because of real investment opportunities that have arisen, technological change. But as the economy is picking up steam, the natural way to ration the demands for investable resources is to let the interest rate rise. And as the interest rate rises, only the most valuable investments will be funded. They're the only ones that can pass this benchmark of having to pay back the money borrowed. But if the central bank steps in and says, well, no, we want to encourage investment, so we're going to keep the interest rate low so that everybody who wants to invest at that low interest rate can now invest at that low interest rate, then you get resources overcommitted. You get more investment projects started that can actually be completed. And that's what the Fed did in the 1920s. They kept the interest rate low when it should have been rising, and that's what the Fed did in the 2000s, particularly 2002 to 2005. Under Greenspan, they kept the Fed funds rate too low for too long. The economy was recovering and picking up steam, but they wouldn't let the interest rate rise. And that led to this overinvestment, malinvestment in projects that couldn't be profitably completed when the interest rate had to rise. And I mean, you can see them. You can still see them today. If you fly into Las Vegas and look out the window of the plane, you see these half-built communities where they've paved the road and laid the foundations, but no structures have gone up. Right? So they pulled the plug in the middle of the investment project. Now, that I think helps account. I think it's, well, it accounts for the onset of the Depression. It accounts for the collapse of the housing boom in the United States and in Europe. What by itself it doesn't really account for is why the Great Depression lasted so long and was so great, and why the recovery today is so sluggish. And for that, I think we need a theory of what happens next. We need an account of what happened next. And in the Great Depression, there were a couple things that happened. One is the money supply didn't just stop growing, it actually shrank in the United States because of bank runs. But policy out of Washington, D.C., and in other countries there were other similar policies, didn't let the economy recover. It didn't allow resources to be reallocated, but decided to put more money after good money after bad, try to keep investments alive long after they stopped being sustainable. Oh, I just remembered I have a clock in my pocket. When did I start? About 7? Okay. So I think there's not actually a real unreconcilable conflict between Hayek's account of the Great Depression and Milton Friedman's account of the Great Depression. Right? Hayek explains why the boom didn't last. Friedman and Schwartz's account of the Great Depression, if you're familiar with that, is that the main trouble was that the money supply collapsed so deeply. But I think those two are consistent. I think that helps explain why the Depression was so long-lived, why the decline was so steep for several years and not just for 1 year.
Sorry, could you repeat that thought again?
Yeah, so I said Hayek's theory explains why there had to be a recession, but it doesn't really explain by itself why the recession was so deep and why recovery took so long. I think we need to supplement it with considerations like the ones Friedman and Schwartz introduced, that the money supply collapsed, and from the US and from France, which the Bank of France was hoarding gold at this time, the deflationary forces spread to the rest of the world. Now, Hayek has kind of gotten a bad rap over the years from Milton Friedman, in fact, and other people, some Keynesians, who accuse him of having the following view. Here's a quote from Friedman. If you go back to the 1920s, you had the Austrians sitting in London, Hayek and Lionel Robbins, and saying you just have to let the bottom drop out of the world. You've just got to let it cure itself. You can't do anything about it. I think by encouraging that kind of do-nothing policy, both in Britain and the United States, they did harm. There are a couple of problems with this argument. One is that the timing is all wrong. Right? Hayek's book isn't published till 1931, so the policies had already started long before anybody could possibly have been listening to Hayek. And there's no evidence that policymakers were reading Hayek. It might have been helpful if they had, but they weren't. I wrote an entire article attacking a Keynesian economist named Brad DeLong for his version of this argument. And the way DeLong spins the argument, he finds a quote from Herbert Hoover saying that Lionel Robbins has explained the Great Depression. But the problem with that, as an explanation of Hoover's policy, is that Hoover quotes him in his memoirs published in 1952. He quotes from Lionel Robbins' book, which was published in 1934. And if you go on to read what Hoover says about his own policies during the Great Depression, he says, well, I was being told that we should just let the economy liquidate itself. He attributed this view to his Secretary of Commerce, Andrew Mellon. There's this famous apocryphal quote from Mellon which goes, liquidate land, liquidate labor. Trouble is, Mellon never said it. Hoover said it and put those words in Mellon's mouth, and ever since people have been quoting Hoover's memoirs as though they authentically represented Mellon's views. It's a big fabrication. If you actually read Mellon's own speeches, he said nothing like that. But anyway, I digress. It's unfair to Hayek. That's the point I'm trying to make here. It's unfair to Hayek because Hayek's view was that there is a monetary policy role if you have a central banking system, which is, first, don't overexpand in the first place. Don't feed the boom in the first place. But if it turns into a rout, if there's shrinkage in the money supply because of bank runs, try to stabilize the situation, try to keep the volume of spending going. If people want to hoard more money, provide the cash for them to hoard. So Hayek's actual policy norm, what he sometimes called neutral money, is to try to stabilize what he called the money stream. Now, there are two ways to fail to do that. And in the 20s, the central banks failed to do that. They pumped up the money stream. They injected too much money, created an excess supply of money, drove down interest rates, and fed the overinvestment. They made the reverse problem in the 30s, committed the reverse error in the 30s. Okay, well, Keynes's view was, of course, very different, and in the book I talk about the ways in which it was different. And Hayek and Keynes went back and forth about what was causing the discoordination in the economy. And as I said, Keynes just denied that there was any mechanism ever for coordinating savings and investment. Hayek then commented on Keynes's general theory in very polite language. Mr. Keynes's assertion that there is no automatic mechanism in the economic system to keep the rate of saving and the rate of investing equal might with equal justification be extended to the more general contention that there is no automatic mechanism in the economic system to adapt production to any shift in demand. In other words, he's saying Keynes doesn't understand supply and demand. This is kind of an academic bitch slap, but in very polite language. But you notice he called him Mr. Keynes because Keynes didn't have a PhD in economics. But Keynes's theory wins the day. Why does it win the day? Well, it tells people what they want to hear. It's a breath of optimism and hope, everybody describes it as. People who were there at the time, like John Kenneth Galbraith, talk about how he studied in England, learned the general theory, came back to Harvard and discovered people were already excited about it, and everybody was optimistic that something could be done. Right? Whereas Hayek's theory was regarded as being very gloomy because it said, you've already made the mistake and now you have to pay for it. Okay, well, let me sort of shift and talk about the present. The Hayek-Keynes rap video, I think, has sort of struck a chord because Hayek's theory actually kind of captures what happens. It's pretty clear there was a credit boom. Right? So this isn't a theory that claims to explain all swings in the economy, all times and all places. You can have other kinds of recessions. You can have harvest failures. I can give you examples if you... The Panic of 1873 in the United States was caused by an attack of locusts on the wheat crop. But it's pretty clear that we did have a credit bubble. We did have unsustainable investment, particularly in housing. And there's a big run-up in construction. You can see it in the data. And if Hayek's kind of advice had been followed, then this run-up in construction would have been accompanied by rising interest rates, and the rising interest rates would have choked off this boom before it really got out of hand, before everybody thought they could refinance everything at really low rates and get their money out before it fell apart. But the Fed was determined to keep interest rates low. And so we not only had more investment in housing, we had, of course, incredible price spikes in housing and in the stock market, which has been sort of less remarked on. And what's fueling this expansion is monetary policy. It's the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates low, and they do that by injecting money. And you can look at the numbers and see the expansion in broad measures of the money supply, M2 or MZM. One symptom of that, and of course the way the Fed thinks about policy is not to look at monetary aggregates, they look at interest rates. But if we look at interest rates, what do we see? Real interest rates, that is the difference between the inflation rate and the interest rate in the market, was negative for about 3 years, 2002 to 2005. Prices were rising faster than what you had to repay on your loan. So if you just bought a warehouse full of goods and sat on it, you could make a profit. At the same time, if you bought treasury bonds, right, inflation was going to more than eat away the interest you were earning. So, as one person put it, if you invested in a warehouse of toilet paper, you did better than investing in treasury paper. But negative interest rates, of course, are a subsidy to borrowers. It's encouragement to borrowing, and a lot of people did borrow. A lot of people got very highly leveraged, especially in the housing market. There's a more sort of technical way of analyzing the Fed's policy known as the Taylor rule. I don't know if some of you are familiar with that, but it's a kind of formula for judging where the Fed's interest rate ought to be to maintain a kind of neutrality toward the market. And the Fed funds rate was way below what the Taylor rule was prescribing for about, well, here I have a chart here, between about 2000 and 2006. So for a long time, it was too low by this sort of very standard way of parsing it. Now, where did the credit go? The credit went overwhelmingly into housing. I haven't looked at the European case, but it's clear that happened as well in some European countries. In the U.S., the growth of credit going into the housing market was incredible. It was like 18% per year at one point, but over a long period it was better than 12% a year. And of course, the population's not growing at 12%. So there's no way that housing construction can grow by 12% indefinitely. Now, the Fed was ignoring all this because they were focused on consumer prices, and consumer prices weren't rising very rapidly. But that was also true of the 1920s. Consumer prices were actually flat in the 1920s, but to keep it flat in an era of growing productivity means the central bank is injecting credit and distorting interest rates. Now, the reason it was in housing in particular, at least in the United States, is a set of non-monetary policies, a set of regulatory policies that were encouraging, providing mandates for housing finance and subsidies for housing finance. There was the Federal Housing Authority, there was the Housing and Urban Development Department, there was, most very importantly, these two giant mortgage repackagers, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which had an implicit federal backing, which meant they could borrow very cheaply, just a tiny bit above the Treasury rate, way below any other financial intermediary could borrow at. And they were dedicated to churning those funds into housing, and they grew enormously during this period, from a mere $1 trillion operation to a $12 trillion operation, to the point where they were holding or guaranteeing 60% of the mortgage market in the United States. Of course, they went broke in a spectacular way. I only regret that I didn't short their stock. I should have seen that coming. Because when the subprime fiasco started to happen, it was pretty clear that they were going to be implicated. Or sorry, they were going to suffer. So the bust came. Now, there are some economists who I respect who are very good bloggers, like Scott Sumner, if anybody's familiar with him, who think the recession could have been avoided if the Fed had just stepped on the monetary gas, right, who had kept nominal income from shrinking at all. Of course, there was a period of actual deflation. There were 2 quarters of actual deflation in the United States. And real income fell quite dramatically. So nominal income is just the product of the price level and real income. Clearly that was falling. But if enough money had been injected, could the shrinkage in real income have been avoided? I don't think so. I mean, there was a real problem, which was overinvestment in housing, and those housing investments had to be scrapped. There was a lot of waste there. And so the recovery we're seeing now is one where the economy fell below its previous path, and now it's kind of running parallel to it, but it's not catching up to where it would have been. But it couldn't have kept on that path forever. That was a boom based on false premises or false pretenses or false expectations about how interest rates could stay low forever. Now, one of the unfortunate side effects of the bust has been the revival of another side of Keynesian economics, which is the fiscal side, the advice about government spending and borrowing. Fiscal Keynesianism is not actually in the general theory, but it was developed after the Second World War by people like Alvin Hansen and other followers of Keynes, who sort of came up with the textbook versions of Keynesian economics. And there are kind of two key propositions in what I'm calling fiscal Keynesianism. One is, for any given level of government spending, it's better to finance it with debt than with taxes. Because, now, if you understand accounting, you know that when you say finance it with debt, you mean finance it with future taxes. Right? Because the debt has to be serviced. But it's better to finance it with future taxes than with present taxes. Because if you think of the economy as a kind of circular flow of liquid around and around, the taxes are a leakage. Right? Whereas debt, it's not in the picture, so we can just ignore it having any effects. But taxes discourage economic activity. They drain money out of the, drain resources out of the economy, funds out of the economy, I should say. But debt doesn't seem to do that in their model anyway. So that's, you should finance with debt rather than taxes. And secondly, you should have more government spending. More government spending will create more real income, except in this limiting case called full employment. Right? And there are some Keynesians who will say, look, no, it's symmetric advice. You should run a deficit during a recession, but you should run a surplus during a boom. Except that when you read in real time what Keynesians are advising, 95% of the time the economy is in recession, or below potential output is the way they put it. Right? So even though the U.S. economy is in a recovery, it's still below this path known as potential output, so there should still be deficits being run. And if the economy never catches up to that path, well, then you just run deficits forever. Now, so the view is that government spending will lift the economy. And I quote some early Keynesians promulgating this view, where they say this, I mean, and they're quite aware that running deficits means issuing more debt. Here's what an economist named Otto Eckstein, who I actually took a course from when I was an undergraduate, said, the creation of debt in this situation, meaning at less than full employment, raises output and is likely to raise investment and the total growth of the economy. So don't worry about crowding out investment by having government borrow more, you know, on this idea that investable funds are scarce, and if the government takes more, then industry gets less. No. The government spending is going to generate so much prosperity that it's actually going to crowd in more private investment, and everybody gains. It's better than a free lunch. It's like a free lunch with a free dessert. There's a multiplier effect, is the way it's usually expressed. There's no trade-off between consumption and investment. There's never a trade-off, well, except at full employment, which is rare, between planting your seed corn and eating your corn. You can have both. Scarce resources are not really a constraint. And of course, the person who's done more to republicize this view in recent years is Paul Krugman. Krugman makes the following statement in one of his columns: anything that improves the state of the economy, including fiscal stimulus, leads to more investment and hence raises the economy's future potential. So below full employment, any debt-financed government spending actually increases the prosperity of the economy. notice you don't have to do any cost-benefit test for the government spending. Any government spending is going to take up resources that are completely unused, just slack in the economy. It's as though these resources are sitting there not being used, and private entrepreneurs can't figure out how to use them. But shovel-ready projects, that'll put them to work. And so we can, the metaphor Keynes used, I couldn't make this up, was that you could build pyramids, or you could hire people to dig ditches and other people to fill them in. And that's supposed to provide prosperity to the economy. Well, the result of this kind of fiscal advice going back to the 60s and 70s was a chronic series of deficits, not just in the US, but in other countries. But this chronic deficit has now become acute. Right? It used to run 3% of GDP. Now it's 10% of GDP. And of course, it spiked upward during the recession, but now that the recession's officially over and the economy is recovering, it still hasn't come down. We're still running deficits of around 10% a year. So where is this going to lead? Well, if we look at Greece, we see a government that was running a deficit of 13% of GDP, and in 2009 had a debt of 113% of GDP. The crisis hit in early 2010, where two-year government bonds were yielding over 12%. Now, when you're paying more interest on your bonds, you're paying a percentage rate on your bonds which exceeds your economy's growth rate. Right? The unpleasant arithmetic of it, as the phrase goes, is that the debt is going to compound faster than the economy grows. Then the debt to GDP ratio just has to go up and up and up. And there's no way to pay that back, right, if the economy's not growing as fast as the debt is growing. So that's a problem. By my calculation, the US is about 6 years behind Greece, right, in reaching 113% level of debt to GDP. So that's 2015. Let's look at another country, Ireland. Ireland had its crisis in the fall of 2010. And in Ireland, it was related to the fallout from the financial crisis. Namely, the Irish government decided they had to bail out the largest banks, and the largest banks were large relative to the Irish economy. So in 1 year, the Irish government ran a budget deficit of 31%. And the debt went from 25% of GDP in 2007 to 97% of GDP in just a few years. And at that point, the bond market said, well, that doesn't look sustainable. And Ireland started paying 8% on its bonds, which not as bad as Greece, but still unsustainable, right? The debt is going to compound faster. So, how do we avoid this situation? How do we get some fiscal discipline back into the system? Well, it's like the old doctor's advice. When you say, doctor, it hurts when I do this, the doctor says, don't do that. I mean, there used to be a kind of implicit fiscal constitution that you ran deficits if there was an unavoidable spike in expenditures, like somebody was invading you. And then you paid it off, ran surpluses in the subsequent years until you got the debt back to an insignificant level. And that used to be the practice. Debts go up in wars and come down afterward. Adam Smith actually was against doing that. He said, look, if we let the British government borrow money to fight wars, they're not just fighting defensive wars. They're going out and trying to colonize the world, which is a big waste of money. We should finance wars on a pay-as-you-go basis, and that way we'll have fewer of them. Anyway, so it's a problem if the deficits are, exceed the present value of the government's tax revenues. That makes it impossible to repay. So you either need some kind of rule that limits the size of deficits, and they're starting to adopt these kinds of rules in Europe now. Switzerland has adopted what's called a debt brake, and Germany has adopted what's called a debt brake, which says that government spending basically can't grow faster than moving average of tax revenues over previous years. All right, so you can raise it in an emergency, you can do it for 1 year, but you got to bring it down again. And we'll see whether that mechanism actually works when it's put to the test. Of course, the European Central Bank Constitution, which said no financing of government debt, looked good on paper until it came to a stress test. But historically, the way the fiscal authorities were limited was the market wouldn't accept much debt. And why was that? Because the world was on a gold standard. When you're on a gold standard and the government issues bonds, the bonds have to be repaid in gold. Governments cannot print gold. Therefore, when they try to sell bonds, the market will say, do you have a credible commitment to the future tax revenues necessary to service and retire this debt? If yes, we'll lend you money at a reasonable rate. If no, we won't. And so it wasn't any sort of explicit limit on spending, but it was the market imposing this discipline on debt issuers. Now, why didn't that work for Greece? Right? Because Greece doesn't issue its own currency. It uses the euro, which is issued somewhere else. So from Greece's point of view, it seems like it's an external currency. It should work the same way. But the market failed to impose the same kind of discipline on Greece, and I think the reason is the European Central Bank is not the gold standard. The European Central Bank is in a position to print enough money to liquidate Greece's debts or inflate away Greece's debts. And the people who bought the Greek bonds at what in retrospect looked like ridiculously low yields were implicitly counting on somebody, the ECB or the European Union, to bail Greece out. And for a while it looked like they might be right. Of course, the problem was so big that eventually the bondholders had to take a haircut. But I think that's the difference. The European Central Bank could not credibly commit not to bailing out the countries that were part of the euro, although it's in the European Central Bank Constitution. So it's kind of a tragedy because the European Central Bank Constitution, in my view, was kind of the last great hope for fiat money. It was a beautifully written constitution that said our one goal is price stability, and by price stability we mean inflation less than 2%. And they had Germans running the show, right? But when push came to shove, the European Central Bank is now monetizing the debts of Greece and Ireland and Spain, and it doesn't look good. So if the gold standard can't be restored, then some more direct kind of measures restricting government spending have to be adopted. Now, how this all applies to Australia, I leave to the question and answer session, but I'll take questions now. Thanks. Here.
Where in the world can we find the best example of monetarist economics in action, or in a period of time in a country where it's worked and we've got an example we can point to?
Yeah. Until recently, Switzerland. I mean, Switzerland, the Swiss franc has been the fiat money that's held its value the best since the war, since the Second World War. And the people running the Swiss National Bank actually were monetarists. And they looked at monetary aggregates and they did it more or less the way Friedman would have wanted it done. Now, about a year ago, the Swiss franc was appreciating so rapidly against the euro that Swiss exporters screamed bloody murder, and it's quite sad. The Swiss National Bank declared that they're not going to let the Swiss franc rise anymore against the euro. They're going to peg it to the euro, which means they're going to have the same inflation rate as the euro from here on in until further notice. So who's second best after that? I'm not sure. It used to be Germany, but of course Germany folded up shop. Yeah.
Has everybody heard of Peter Schiff?
Yep.
Yeah. Basically, in Peter Schiff's new book, he predicts the next crash. He calls it the government treasury crash, essentially.
Yeah.
for that to happen, interest rates have to go up.
Yeah.
He predicted the housing bubble, so he was correct on that. So I share the same view as Peter Schiff, and I have my own ideas as to what will trigger the interest rate going up.
Yeah.
What do you think? What should we be looking for? What signals should we be looking for to predict when that will happen?
Well, just sort of inferring from what got Greece in trouble and what got Ireland in trouble and so on, a rapidly rising debt to GDP ratio with no credible plan to bring it back down in the future. Now, the U.S. has a high ratio of debt to GDP now, 100%, a little over 100%. And of course, Japan has an incredibly high ratio, it's close to 200%. But the U.S. and Japan have not can still borrow very, very cheaply. Japan, of course, has a long track record of 0 to negative 2% inflation. But Japanese debt market is now starting to get a little shaky. There's been talk about raising taxes in Japan in order to try to shore up. So even Japan is starting to talk about what the journalists call austerity, which means respecting the fact that there's a budget constraint. Yeah, so that's that's the sort of crude indicator, a rising ratio of debt to GDP that doesn't show any signs of reversing. I mean, and in the U.S., although the slope of the growth picks up in the recession, it hasn't tapered off since the end of the recession. So it's sort of entered the unpleasant arithmetic stage. Now, the U.S. is still borrowing it, and the other signal is the interest rate goes above the economy's growth rate. Well, of course, then the rout is on. The U.S. and Japan are not in that phase yet, but all it takes is enough lenders to become skeptical about the ability to repay without inflating the currency. So
That's exactly what
Japan can borrow in yen, the U.S. can borrow in dollars, and so they can inflate away the debt, but that's not a free option, right? The suspicion that they might inflate it away will make interest rates go up now. Yeah.
And do you think we're heading for hyperinflation?
Not anytime soon. I think central bankers do understand more than they did in Germany in 1920 about how to avoid hyperinflation, which is stop running the printing press.
But they haven't stopped, have they?
But there is certainly the danger of double-digit inflation returning. I mean, they can't stop it that quickly, even if they're determined. But typically, you get hyperinflation in a country that can't pay government workers any other way than just printing the currency to do so. So in recent years, it's been limited to, Latin America and Zimbabwe. But if you get into a fiscally untenable situation, it can happen anywhere because it becomes the only way. I mean, that's what the budget constraint says. If you get to a point where the market is so saturated with your debt that nobody wants to buy it, and if the attempt to issue more of it makes the interest rate go up so much that the burden of servicing the old debt goes up rather than down, or so that then you can't borrow any more money, essentially. Then the only thing left is the printing press. So it can happen. I don't anticipate it happening soon in the U.S. or Europe, but the probability is not zero.
This is an awesome talk, by the way. Just two questions if I can indulge into.
Okay. I'll hear the first one first, and then I'll...
Yeah, sure. Okay. I've read a bit about Saddam and Gaddafi not wanting to accept US dollars for their resources, and particularly in Gaddafi's case wanting to go to some form of gold standard. Anyway, you know what happened to both of those guys. And the thrust of my question is, does America's military might, to what extent does America's military might perhaps hold afloat the impending implosion of its And the second question is just a general political one. Your thoughts on Ron Paul's campaign and in the future for America and what seems to be the inevitable result, particularly for the Republican race anyway?
Well, I mean, I think the U.S. has wasted a lot of money on these military interventions overseas. And in a situation of 10% deficits, there's going to be pressure to cut back on that. So that's sort of one small silver lining in the cloud. But yeah, I think it will constrain American military adventures. I have a great deal of respect for Ron Paul. In fact, I saw Ron Paul, what's today? I saw Ron Paul on Thursday. I testified in front of his subcommittee. He had a hearing, of all things, on fractional reserve banking. I think that's probably a first in the history of the U.S. Congress. I mean, his presidential campaign is over. But he introduced a lot of ideas that nobody else was talking about. I wrote a piece for the Cato Institute back in 2008 called, well, my title for the article was, Is the Gold Standard a Crazy Idea? They put a really strange title on it. Is the gold standard still the gold standard among monetary institutions? Because if you go on Google and Google the phrase gold standard, it most often comes up as in this phrase, this way of performing carpal tunnel surgery is the new gold standard. So I guess that's what they meant. But anyway, basically that piece was in response to Ron Paul raising the issue of the gold standard and coming under attack by other people that saying it was a crazy idea. So I was sort of dissecting the arguments and saying, yeah, it's not such a crazy idea if you actually look at the track record. And I mean, he gives me some hope that in maybe a generation, the Republican Party may actually embrace some ideas instead of being the Tweedledum Party running against the Tweedledee Party. So I think he's had a very positive impact on the debate. I don't agree with him on 100% of everything. But I think he's certainly brought a lot more discussion to monetary policy and monetary institutions. I mean, for many, many years, when the chairman of the Federal Reserve System would come to testify, the congressmen would fall all over themselves trying to, kiss his ring. Ron Paul was one of the first to actually ask some hard questions, and I think that's had a very salutary impact on the demand for my services anyway. Yeah.
It's good that you're talking about the gold standard and reading about that, and people say, well, it ends up being one of these things where people say people are lunatics and stuff, but I think the point that you made, I just wanted, if you could discuss a bit more about that. It's not so much the gold standard, but the discipline that can be placed on there. Well, besides the gold, is that an easier way to introduce that idea into the marketplace, that rather than talk about gold, going back to a standard or something?
Yeah, well,
what disciplines you can have?
Yeah, I could be more coy about it and say, well, what we would like to have would be an apolitical money that's not issued by the government that's borrowing in that currency. It would be nice if it could circulate internationally and yet not depend on the good policy of any particular government. The head of the Chinese central bank actually made a speech saying pretty much that. And then the punchline wasn't, gee, I just reinvented the classical gold standard. The punchline was, the IMF should resuscitate the SDR. Yeah, well, good luck getting good monetary policy out of the IMF. But, I mean, those are, the constraint it puts on fiscal authorities, the fact that it's an international money and yet is apolitical, right? So the European Central Bank at least created a money that circulates around Europe, and that's a great convenience. There's a lot to be said for that. But they didn't, and they tried in the Constitution, but they didn't succeed in divorcing the creation of money from politics. And that's the ultimate problem. But any commodity standard, gold, silver, a basket of whatever you like, would do that. So that's a great virtue of that approach. Yeah.
Towards the end of the main talk, you hinted at the question, how does this apply to Australia?
Yeah.
So how does this apply to
Well,
Australia?
no, the reason I deferred that is that you know more about the Australian situation than I do. I understand that the debt to GDP ratio is not actually that bad. Right?
Well, how about we elaborate on the question, what's your prognosis for China's economy?
Well, China seems to be starting to slow down, and part of it is due to credit being very easy for many years and a lot of strange investments being made. And you have the sort of classic symptom of an overinvestment boom, which is cities that are unoccupied. So how big a slowdown it's going to be, I don't know. But I mean, China is an economy that was so far inside the efficient frontier, right, that a lot of growth is possible, and I think a lot of growth is still possible because the economic boom is sort of limited to the east coast of the country. But you know, it probably won't continue at 10% a year indefinitely. I mean, I'm not really a forecaster, but that would be my sense of it. If something's too good to last, it won't. Yeah.
Steve Keynes had some fun, like you, picking fights with Paul Krugman, and some of his work seems consistent with Austrian theory in terms of the run-up in credit causing the boom. And
there's a little bit of overlap between Hayek and Minsky.
Yeah. One central to Steve Keynes' work is the concept that private banking system creates credit first and reserves follow, which is at odds with Hayek's work. Have you looked into that, or like that was articulated in a recent online spat between the two of them?
Well, it depends on how the central bank behaves. In a system without a central bank, that doesn't happen. Banks are constrained by the availability of gold or silver reserves. If banks are going to create liabilities first and hope for the reserves to come later, then they must be counting on a policy of a fiat money issuing central bank. And the central bank may or may not behave that way. It doesn't have to. Right? So what he's describing is not the general case, I don't think. Yeah.
You touched a lot on little bits of advice here and there.
Yeah.
What would be your advice to an incoming Romney administration?
Oh, gosh.
Centerpiece of your advice about how to unravel the current mess.
You mean advice that they might actually take, or advice I would give anybody?
In a practical.
Well, so, I mean, Milton Friedman used to say, you should have your ideal, and then you should have a sort of phased series of practical proposals that are better than what we've got now. Well, when it comes to monetary policy, the sort of most reasonable thing that's a move in the right direction is to rewrite the Federal Reserve's mandate so that they focus more exclusively on what they can actually control, which is the value of the dollar, and not on unemployment or real growth. Now, how much effect that would actually have, I don't know. It would probably change their press releases as the rationale they give for their policies they've adopted. But I give this advice to the Obama administration if it's reelected. The control of the explosion of entitlements is the real problem on the fiscal side. And I mean, there's been a lot of wishful thinking on both sides about, well, if we just cut waste, fraud, and abuse, the problem goes away, or if we just get the economy growing at 4%, this is wishful thinking on the Republican side, 4% in real terms. Yeah, well, that's not going to happen. Right? That's bucking all the trends. You can raise the level of income by getting rid of bad regulations, but that doesn't make it grow at 4% ad infinitum. So you have to control spending. So how to form winning coalitions that make it possible to cut entitlement programs, I have no idea. But that's the problem. An interesting story. I mean, I'm not his psychoanalyst, but when he was asked about this while he was head of the Fed, he would say very funny things. He would say, well, the policy we're pursuing is actually mimicking the gold standard. He said, now, if you wanted to go back to a gold standard, Congress would have to do that. I can't do that as head of the Fed. But what I can do is pursue a monetary policy that does what a gold standard would do for you, and that's what I'm trying to do.
What about put interest rates to zero?
Well, that part is a little hard to reconcile with the statement I just quoted. But yeah, he began to think that it was a new economy, right? He used that phrase. There wasn't any such thing as a nationwide housing bubble. And he was confident in his own ability to, smooth the economy, a little too confident. But there's one other person I blame for this, and that's Ben Bernanke. While Greenspan was still head of the Fed, Ben Bernanke was appointed to the Board of Governors and was whispering in Greenspan's ear that deflation was a real threat. And Greenspan apparently took this seriously. And so even when deflation was not a real threat, they were erring on the side of injecting enough money to make sure it wasn't going to be a threat. Then after he left the Fed, Greenspan, of course, wrote a memoir explaining his decision-making process, and he was kind of faced with this cruel choice in explaining the financial crisis, which was either I did something wrong or the market did something wrong. Well, I think it must have been the market, and so I'm, shocked and appalled that the market let me down like that. But he seemed to be incapable of considering that, well, maybe I kept credit a little too easy for a little too long.
It would seem to me that Keynesianism rules the intellectual landscape in the halls of power. America certainly does here.
Sure.
So in that case, when all the important people, politicians and bureaucrats, labour under misconceptions about economics, what hope is there for long-term economic prosperity in the West?
Well, yeah, the constraint is not going to come from people who enjoy exercising the levers of power, and Keynesian economics gives them, grants them that prerogative, and so they like it. It's going to have to come from taxpayers and citizens who won't stand for it anymore. But it is a real problem that in monetary policy in particular, that it's this view that it's the domain of experts. The rest of us can't say anything about it. And of course the experts have an axe to grind, so it's a big problem. And it's a big problem in the economics profession because I don't know what the numbers are in Australia, but in the US, the Federal Reserve System employs more than 400 economists, and they hire another 500 or so academics as consultants. And it has a very sort of imparts, how can I put this politely, a kind of status quo bias to the views that it's prudent to express if you want to get ahead in the profession, because here's the biggest employer of monetary economists that has an institutional interest. So you don't want to rock that boat too much.
Well, surely an Austrian economist has nothing to offer a government institution.
Well, that's right. We're not giving them a rationale for
Their existence.
exerting their discretion. But I mean, people in politics sincerely believe that they can make life better by exercising their discretion. And Alan Greenspan sincerely believed, and Ben Bernanke sincerely believes, that by exercising their discretion, they can make life better for everybody. They just need to be disabused of that. So it's an ongoing educational struggle, and in the economics profession, trying to relearn the lessons that economists once knew, which are featured in my new book.
So would it be right to say that the increase in prosperity, and there is general increase in
Well,
standard of living in the West,
Yeah.
is despite.
That's right. That's due to Steve Jobs. That's not due to Alan Greenspan.
But there must come a time when where it turns, where the innovation of entrepreneurs is suffocated by this regulation.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, we've built up a certain level of real capital that enables us to have a high standard of living, but we can eat into it if we're not careful. Yeah.
You mentioned before about investment in relation to population. I know there's been obviously an admission that the rate of growth in China is going to be smaller than it has been in previous years. And of course,
Because of the demographics.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so you've got this negative population growth in China. You've got the government saying that they're looking to domesticate their economy to sort of compensate for fall-offs in European and American demand. How confident are you, given their political culture, of the accuracy of their economic reporting?
It's a very good question. I don't know.
I mean, where are the assumptions about the accuracy of economic reporting from China coming from? And if there is a skepticism about how is that sort of
I don't
corroborated?
I don't really know enough to comment on that. You would think there should be some skepticism because we found out after the fact that the Soviet numbers were not really very accurate.
Other the Greece?
Well,
Or the Australians.
Greece hired Goldman Sachs. I mean, they hired professionals to falsify their numbers.
I'm sure you could keep on answering questions until they try and kick us out. Ron, would you like to come forward and we've got a small gift for you.
This is Larry's first introduction to an Australian audience on this visit, and we structured the visit so that you are introduced to Australia at the furthest possible distance from Canberra. Okay. So you're getting in touch with the real. These are the real people, and you gathered from the questioning tonight. These are the real people.
You know, I have spent time in Canberra. I spent 6 weeks in ANU, and the usual response is, "I'm sorry to hear that."
and we hear repeatedly, if anyone listens to the morning news, that Australia came through this global financial crisis unscathed. A remarkable comment, and so many Australians believe it. Well, I think we came through bloody scathed, not unscathed, because we have a government debt of about $32,000 per person, and we have the highest rate of household debt in the world. That's Australia, which is $48,000 per person. You add them both together, and the total figure is $82,000 of debt per person in Australia that we didn't have. The only reason we're still in existence is that this federal government that we've got inherited a magnificent surplus, which is gone. So we've inherited instead an $82,000 debt per person. And there's a lot of young people in Australia getting very angry about it. Now, you'll meet a totally different audience at lunchtime tomorrow. They won't worry. The people you meet at lunchtime won't be worried about leaving this $82,000 debt per person to the young people, but they will be worried that around about now they'll be realising that their superannuation fund is about worth half of what it was a couple of years ago. And this is when it'll start hitting them. Hey, that can't be unscathed. So Larry, I'm so glad that you're with us. And moving around Australia, you'll go from Perth to Melbourne and Sydney, and you'll get the tenor. You'll meet some businessmen tomorrow night that some of them are having trouble actually paying the salary of their staff. So the boom is not widespread, and there's some concern about this. But Harry, as a token of I've got to present you with, modestly I'll call this, some Aussie culture. You've produced 4 books, and I've produced 4 books, and this is a boxed version of my last 2. And it's called 100 Years of Australiana. And honestly, it says all you need to know about mining and exploration, all you need to know about money laundering, I had 3 years I spent with a leading merchant bank before the managing director got murdered. All you need to know about starting your own political party, all you need to know about Mona the Madam, and being free in an unfree world, and booms and tears, and how the Harvard graduates succeeded in bringing down the US economy where the communists failed.
You're hitting a little close to home there.